What do you really know about the anatomy of application programming interface? A real understanding of API is a critical element for any PM working in tech. Yet, only a few actually understand the concept. Of all web technologies, APIs have become more and more important to product managers. And with more products offer APIs, you as a product manager can broaden your customer growth and revenue opportunities. But first, we need to forget the buzzwords, understand the fundamentals, and talk about opportunities, challenges, and solutions. Hello, Ligard, and welcome to today's Practical Wednesday session, where we meet every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to advance your product management know-how. And today, APIs, tech meets business on the cloud. By the way, I'm Moriya Kassis, founder and general manager of Product League, and what we do is helping you to become the best product manager you can be. Product League is a mentoring program for product managers by product managers. And if you are new here, please make sure to comment new in the comments because I want to get to know you. If you want more tips, how-to videos, articles, and everything product, so you could become the best product manager you can be, please go ahead and like this video and our page and channel so you'll be notified about all the great content that we're creating just for you. And today, as you know, we're going to talk about APIs, and here with me, there is the best product professional around that I know that is going to talk with us about APIs. I am so happy to welcome Swanand Rao to our stage. How are you, Swanand?
I'm doing good. How are you, Moriya?
I'm good. So happy to have you here with us. And just so you know, guys, why I am so excited about having Swanand here with us today. Swanand Rao is Principal Product Manager at Oracle San Francisco and Product League Mentor. Swanand has a breadth of high-tech industry experience working in different sectors, including financial tech, network technology, storage technology, and telecom sectors. His research interest includes large-scale distributed computing, functional programming, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, leading to 2 patent awards. This is big, Swanand. Good for you. Swanand holds an MBA from Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan, a master's degree in computer science from the University of Southern California, and a bachelor's in computer engineering from the University of Mumbai. And he's the person to talk APIs with us, and I am eager to learn from you today. Are you ready to dive right in? Swanand?
Yes, sure. Yeah, let's go for it.
Super excited to have you here with us. And a reminder to all the leaguers that watch us, we want to get to know you and what is on your heart and mind when it comes to the usage of APIs in product management. So please make sure to use the comments, the chat, and ask us questions. Swanand is here for you. So there is going to be a Q&A at the end of the session, and we want to know what are your questions about APIs. So please make sure to comment and ask us because we are here for you. With no further ado, the stage is yours. Can't wait to learn more.
All right. Hi, everybody. Hope you guys are staying safe in the pandemic. I wanted to thank Moriya for the opportunity to allow me to speak to you guys today. And as you can, the topic of discussion for today is the anatomy of an application programming interface, which is you typically refer to as an API, right? And I'm going to I'm going to go through a very simple example in this talk, and we will work on it together. So let's first talk about the outcome of this talk, right? So what I want to do from this particular presentation is I want you guys to have a holistic understanding of what an API is, irrespective of your background, and therefore help you with your ability to design great products. So Moriya already introduced me, but I'll just say a few words about myself. So I'm Swanand Rao. I am currently a principal product manager with Oracle. I have worked in several industries before, several startups, big corporations. Technology is something which I'm very passionate about. I'm always looking for ways to come up with solutions or ideas which are impactful and which help everybody. So that's a little bit about me. Moriya gave a really nice detailed introduction, so I'm not going to repeat the same thing. Let's move on to the next slide, which is like our purpose, right? So why listen to this talk? And I just have one sort of answer for that, is because you don't have a choice. APIs are so fundamental and they are so basic in today's digital ecosystem that any product manager would be incomplete in his understanding without knowing what an API is. So this talk is meant for improving your fundamental basic understanding of what an API is, and you clearly don't have a choice. You have to listen to this talk, right? So what was my motivation when I designed this particular talk, right? I'm a very big fan of Richard Feynman. He was one of the greatest physicists of modern times, and he was an absolutely wonderful teacher as well, right? And he had like several amazing quotes that he came up with, but one of the quotes that resonates very strongly with me is, if you cannot explain something in simple terms, then you probably don't understand it. And my motivation to do this talk was to explain you an API in absolutely simple terms, to clear your understanding of what an API is. And that way you would be able to not only just explain an API to others, but also with that understanding, develop very strong sort of APIs and features and ultimately products. Right? So that's the motivation of this talk. So there you go, right? APIs. Can like, I don't know, I know, Moriya, we can do this interactive, but what does an API mean for you guys? Can you guys respond in the chat saying what is an API? Have you heard of an API? What does an API mean for you? Can we, Moriya, do we take like a couple of minutes to wait for it, or how does it work?
So what we're going to do is, guys, please, as Swanand asked, please comment in the chat and let us what is API for you. At the meantime, while we're giving everyone the opportunity to think and to comment, let's challenge them with one more question. Do you have another question? So we'll use it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, like what does an API mean to you? Have you used it? That's the first question. And then the second question that I would like you guys to think about is, what is a very basic example, or like if you can come up with an example of like an API, right, that you have used, maybe
Great.
when you're growing up, right? And APIs is like an application programming interface, is not a very new concept. It has been around for a long time. We all have used it. It's just that it has become this buzzword recently because of the proliferation of things like apps and the sort of explosion of different services over the internet, like cloud being a recent addition to it, right? So yeah, once let's give you guys a couple of minutes to go over it. But like, as you can see on the slide, right, APIs are everywhere, right? All of us, all the individuals, everybody today and we all are connected to the digital ecosystem. So anybody who is connected to the digital ecosystem is interacting with APIs. It may be logging onto your Facebook, posting an Instagram post.
Don't give them ideas. They need to give us the ideas in the comments.
Right. But
we already have a few.
You already have the answer in front of you.
Yes, but we already have a few.
Right. So yes. Apart from this, can you think of any other APIs? Right?
Exactly. So exactly that.
Put up some icons over here. Right?
That's great. So
let me go to the comment section, right, Moriya?
Yes, so we have Laura who's saying that an API is a channel for communication between two systems.
Yeah, that's a good one. Cool.
Yes. As an example, we have Pramod who's saying Google Maps.
Yeah.
That's a great one. And Ziv is saying API can be a product for specific companies as well.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
interesting. Cool.
Maayan is saying auto connection to allow simple actions between systems.
Okay. I like the terminology of connections, a connector.
Yes, this is
My smart.
well written.
Hmm.
And Karanun
CR.
Karanuakar, you'll probably know how to pronounce it better than I will.
Smart
He's saying
thermostat.
yes,
Okay.
the fact that it connects two together. We have Laura again with an example for CRM communications with end client platforms through APIs. That's a great example.
Right. Cool.
And
And then there is Gal.
Gal, exactly, who says, I work for a cybersecurity startup that its product itself is based on API system between the mail server and our software.
This is fantastic. Cool. So we
This
have
is your
like,
alley.
yeah, these are all valid sort of examples, and these are great examples. So clearly, APIs are omnipresent; they are everywhere, right? All of you guys have to know APIs in some form, or use APIs in some form, or develop APIs in some form, right? But let's take a step back. Like I see some really sort of like relatively complicated things like connectors and communications between mail server and our software. So these are fine, but let's try to take a step back and take a step back beyond our current state of digital world, or like before our state of digital world, and let's start with a very, very simple example, right? So let me just go to my slide deck, and there you go. Right. So today we are going to use a very simple yet a very, very powerful service and a system that has been in existence for a long time. It has served the modern communication channel, and when I say modern, it's not like post-internet era, but pre-internet era very well, right? It is a very efficient service, right? So today we are going to take the example of a mailbox, right? All of us at some point, and these days, like relatively none of us do that, but still it is pretty popular. I personally like doing it. We send physical letters, right? So when you look at this particular diagram in front of you, right, what aspect of this diagram, or what in this particular figure is an API? What do you think is an API in this diagram? Right. So we have like a user, Amit, right, who is trying to post a letter. We have the mailbox where the letter goes. We have the postal service where the magic happens, and then the postal service delivers it to the end user, Laura. Right. So what is an API in this? Where is the API in this? Which is what aspect of this figure do you think is an API?
And this question is for you guys. So please use the chat again as you did previously, which was awesome. And I can't wait to see what you're saying. And Laura, our best students for today, saying cool. The postal service.
We have the mailbox. Okay, that's nice.
Anyone
else wants to take a
mailbox?
The user's API is the letter postal service. Okay, the postal service is the application programming interface. Okay, cool. So
we have two who's saying the postal service, and we Karanukar and Laura, and we have Pramod who's suggesting the option of mailbox.
Okay, anyone else wants to take a stab at this?
Laura is giving an explanation. The postal service writes the protocol for handling the mailbox from the mail from mailbox to receiver. And this is our explanation why this is one. David is joining and saying both US mail and postal services.
Okay.
Sheer is also a voter for postal services.
Okay. Cool.
Interesting.
All right. Okay, so I think we have enough responses. So I would say postal service. Okay, so most of you guys think that postal service is actually an API, right? Which Sorry to disappoint you guys, but I think postal service is a one which Laura clearly said that postal service is the one which writes the protocol for handling the mail. So it is the service. The API, we have an envelope as well. The API actually over here, the interface, right? The interface which sits between the service and the user is the mailbox, right? So the mailbox is actually the endpoint which connects the user and the postal service. And that's sort of a very typical definition of an API, right? An API is a connector which connects different services or different endpoints, right? And clearly it is from the name itself, right? It's an application programming interface. So it's an interface which sits between two entities, right? So in our example over here, the API is actually the US mailbox, right? But there we go, right? So that's nice. That's fantastic, right? Now, what we'll do in this talk for a few slides is we will kind of look at the US mailbox as an interface, as an application programming interface, and we'll try to kind of dissect it out and kind of unravel some of the qualities that this mailbox has, which makes it a very, very nice API, right, or a programming interface, right? Now, when I attribute programming to mailbox, what I mean to say is that, like, think of the postal service as a mechanism in which there is a service which exists which distributes and dispatches your mail, right? The mailbox acts as an interface, and the users can be any businesses, right? They can be things like your dentist, who kind of sends you out a Christmas card every Christmas, right, so that you go back to him or her, right, to get your teeth done, dental work done. So what we'll do is we will use this mailbox and we will look at it from different angles and look at some of the attributes which this mailbox provides and tie them to what an API should also have, right? So US mailbox is going to be our centerpiece, and we'll be talking for the next few slides over some of the characteristics of this mailbox, right? So let's go to the next slide. And like the first characteristic of an API is faithfulness, right? So imagine that like you drop a envelope or a letter in the mailbox, and the postal service, instead of delivering it to Laura, it delivers it to Ben, right? That's clearly not what the API was supposed to do, right? The contract between the user Amit and the postal service via this API was, if a letter is addressed to a particular person, the API would take this letter and the postal service would dispatch it to exactly that person, right? So faithfulness is the first quality of an API, right? Which every API should demonstrate, right? So whenever as product managers, we are scoping or defining an API, we got to really scope out what is the expected contract. We have to nail down the contract that this particular API is going to deliver, right? So this is the first major quality that an application programming interface should bring forward, right? I'm going to ask you one question on this is, have you guys experienced any API that you have come across which does not display or which has failed to display this quality of not being faithful in terms of its contract? And if so, what were the reasons behind it, right? So take your time and answer.
That's a super important question.
So in the meantime, let's move to the next quality, and I'll kind of keep on monitoring the comment section to get the feedback from the users to see what answers we get.
So I'll do that. So I'll do it in the backend, so-called, and I'll present it on the screen, so it won't take your attention. And please continue with the slides.
All right. Now, the next quality that every API should demonstrate is fault tolerance, right? We expect an API to work even when disaster strikes, right? Now, I made this funny picture over here where, we have like a big thunderstorm and it's raining. The mailbox doesn't all of a sudden dissolve because there is water on it, right? The mailbox is still resilient. It is fault tolerant. You can go and post an email and it will get delivered. Similarly, an application programming interface should demonstrate fault tolerance, right? If it doesn't do that, then the contract is broken, right? What it means is you posted something into the mailbox, you dropped into the mailbox, and all of a sudden it just disappeared, right? Or it probably never reached the endpoint. So fault tolerance is the second big aspect that every application programming interface should demonstrate. Right? Again, I'm going to repeat the same question, right? In your experience, and I can clearly see all of you guys have in one way or other interacted with an application programming interface, right? So in your experience, have you come across this quality of an API, right? If so, what was it? And uh, did your API was come across a problem because you could not the API was not designed to be fault tolerant, right? So give some example about it. Oh, there you go. I asked my Roomba to clean the kitchen and it cleans the living room. Fantastic. That's very interesting. All right, we move on to the next attribute that every API should have. So an API should allow for concurrent execution, right? Or concurrent, there should be concurrency embedded in an API, right? What I mean by that is, as you can see over here, it's not just Amit who can post a letter. It's probably another user, Ben, who can post a letter, right? And probably the letters can be addressed to the same person. They can be addressed to a different person, right? So every API should demonstrate concurrency. It should allow concurrency. And this is specifically true for modern applications. So all of these characteristics which I'm going through, they are more, they lend themselves towards modern apps and the digital ecosystem as we know it today. So concurrency is another important feature that API should demonstrate. Right. There may be cases where this may not be applicable, but overall, on an average, for any distributed system, a good solid API should demonstrate concurrency. Right. Going to the next quality that we have, right? Every API should demonstrate symmetry as well, right? So symmetry is extremely important as well. What I mean by symmetry, it means that let's say Amit posts letter 1 to Laura, and then Amit posts letter 2 to Laura, right? These are two separate, what we would call as invocations of an API, right? Posting letter 1 is one invocation, posting letter 2 is the second invocation. Both of these invocations should behave exactly the same. There should be symmetry in terms of the execution of these two actions, right? This is slightly different from faithfulness, where faithfulness stands for the correctness. Symmetry stands for sort of repetitive nature, right? So it should be symmetrical across calls as well. So this is another example where I think these are like very basic kind of I would say attributes, but they are very, very strong attributes which every product manager should look for when designing an API. Right? I would definitely want to understand if you guys have seen symmetry in action when working with APIs on your end, right? So let's go to the next slide. Every API should be portable, right? When you go to a mailbox and you drop a mail, let's say San Francisco, it should provide you with the exact same service if you drop a mail in a mailbox in New York, right? So this API, no matter where it is invoked from, no matter which service serves it, it should be portable, right? You should be able to get the exact same service on two different locations that you're getting from any of the mailbox. What it translates to in our digital world is no matter which server you host it on, what is the nature of the hardware that the backend service runs on, an API should work exactly the same across systems, right? And again, this goes back to the very like fundamental aspect of an API is that it's a contract, right? That contract has to be honored no matter where it is invoked from. Right? So portability is another really important aspect of an API that one should look at. And specifically, product managers should keep an eye on portability of an API as well. All right. I think this is the last big attribute that I want to talk when it comes to an API is security, right? So an API definitely has to be secure, right? And I made like a funny picture, right? Like the mailbox should not be something which like, a thief can come and just break into, right? It has to have some level of sort of guard against it, right? Similarly, we don't want the mail to be delivered to some unknown person, right? Because there is sort of a shenanigan setting in the postal service who just randomly drops letters to some just random people, right? So the API should kind of conform to this security, right? An API should be secure. It should protect against any kind of malware or attacks or security breaches, right? And again, this comes down to API being a contract, right? We expect a contract to be secure, right? So this is sort of another fundamental attribute that an API should have, right? I would again pitch a question to the audience here and understand what aspect of security have they come across and what aspect of security have they kind of fallen into trouble with, right? So Sher asked, what is the difference between security and faithfulness? Well, security is just the aspect of, or security can be viewed from the lens of your information being protected, right? Your like the invocation not leading to a random call in a way, right? Whereas faithfulness is more related to the correctness of the workflow, right? So that when a workflow kind of defines an end-to-end kind of a flow, a sort of steps, a set of steps, then those set of steps have to be followed every time. That in my mind is faithfulness. Security, on the other hand, kind of talks more about the ability of a third party or a third person being able to access your information. So faithfulness is a function of the service itself, whereas security can be influenced by external factors. Right? I don't know if that kind of answers your question in a way. So these are sort of the kind of important traits that an application programming interface should display. Next, what we do is we look into a pretty standard typical syntax of an API, right? So every API has some sort of an identifier, right? It has a handle, right? In our example, the identifier is the US mailbox, right? Or the mailbox in general, right? Not just the US mail, but mailbox in general. Why is this an identifier? Because when a user is presented with this interface, the user knows exactly what this interface is going to do, right? So a syntax, as a matter of a syntactical study, the mailbox stands for the identifier of an API. Next comes the parameter list. An API may or may not have a parameter list, right? But typically, most of the APIs would have some sort of a parameter list. These parameters, they serve as sort of configurations or like inputs that the API needs in order to do its service well, right? In our example, the envelope was the envelope with the name on top of it was the parameter, right? So the address of the person sort of is the parameter in our case. The envelope itself, the letter itself, is also another parameter, right? So we had like two parameters in our example. The first was being an envelope, the second being the actual address of the person, right? So these were the two parameters which were supplied to our identifier, right? Or which were packed with our identifier, which is the mailbox, and posted to it. Then the third sort of syntactical kind of element of an API is that most of like it would have a return value, right? Now the return value people would, or like, generally would think of return value as like, some feedback that we get from the API, right? Some of you may claim that like it's not necessary to have a return value, right? Well, the return value does not need to have some tangible or quantifiable aspects to it. And return value can simply be like a okay message, right? In our case, probably like, Laura, once she receives the letter, she gets back to Amit and says that, hey, thanks, I received your letter. Or we can have some sort of a tracking slip that the postal service may send to Amit, right? And he can track that. So a return value is some sort of an handle or some sort of a feedback that the API returns, right? And it is sort of a flag which indicates that the end-to-end invocation of the API is done. It tells you that your API has been invoked, right? Whether it was successful, whether it was not successful, is something that you probably can decipher looking at the return value, right? So on an average, like an API would have these three elements in it. It would have an identifier, it would have a parameter list, and it would have a return. Is there anything that you guys think that you would like envision in the syntactical format of an API? I would be interested to know that. So I have two requests. Can you explain symmetry a little bit? All right, we'll go back to it and let me just move forward a little, or maybe this is a good time to go back to symmetry. So let's talk about symmetry, right? So like, as I said, right? So symmetry is, we expect that multiple invocations. Okay, I am getting a very big comment over here. Moriya,
Yes, but this one is for the end, so it's okay. It's for the Q&A. We are safe.
All right. Okay, cool. So for the symmetry, I would say that, like, going back to the symmetry, right? Like, let's say that you are invoking an API twice, right, or multiple times, right? It is expected that like the flow of the API remains consistent across these invocations, right? So it should be symmetrical, right? We should not have like an asymmetrical invocation where invocation one leads to one workflow and invocation two leads to another workflow. When this happens, it means that the contract is not being observed, right? That's what I would add to what symmetry is. If this answers your concerns, Swati and Olimed, then that's great. If not, I'm happy to sync up or write a note to you offline as well. All right, let's move forward. All right, so we covered syntax. And now I'm going to kind of dive a little bit into, this is these are two sort of perspectives that have been developed, at least in the tech world, around internal and external APIs, right? So typically, what is an internal API? What is an external API, right? APIs are APIs, right? So an external API in my mind, or as a generally accepted definition, would be something that connects your service or like your corporation or your product to the external world, right? To external stakeholders, right? So that's sort of an external API. An internal API, on the other hand, are those interfaces which sort of plumb modules or components within your service together, right? Which stitch components within your service. They are sort of internal connectors, right? And this has become sort of more prominent. And I'm going to use a slightly technical term over here, with the proliferation of microservice-based architecture. It's there everywhere, even with or without microservice architecture. It's very, very relevant, internal APIs. But with microservice architecture, it has become more relevant, right? So if you go to any cloud organization, be it the top 3 cloud providers, uh, the cloud is essentially internally broken into individual microservices, and they kind of, or any big enterprise as well, would have like a microservice based architecture, and these kind of microservices interact with each other, they tie with each other by means of internal API invocations at a very basic level, right? Even if you don't talk about things like microservices, even a very simple or not as simple, but like even a standard software design would have modularities or modules you kind of embedded inside it, right? So in modern systems, at least, it's not a good idea to write monolithic applications, right? So typically you would have your big service broken down into some smaller modules, and these modules would internally interact with each other by means of some sort of an application programming interface, right? So those are, like, I would kind of club them under the internal API sort of classification, right? So typically, as a product manager, you would expect your roles to be slightly different depending on, or lower your roles and your responsibilities, or your tasks to be slightly different when you're dealing with like an external facing API versus an internal facing API. The concepts still remain exactly the same, uh, but an external API would need a more sort of a business oriented focus. It would need a more outbound kind of an approach, whereas an internal API would lead more towards like a more operational kind of an approach, where you want to structure those APIs such that the overall development ecosystem is stable and robust, right? And typically, I really don't like this outbound PM versus inbound PM kind of a terminology, but you would expect outbound PMs to be more associated with external APIs and inbound PMs to be associated more with internal APIs. A lot of us, or many or most of us, usually play dual roles. We have an inbound responsibility as well as an outbound responsibility, but APIs are there everywhere. So as an example, right, as you can see on this slide, right, like the interface between the user Amit and the postal service is the US mailbox, right? And that's sort of an externally facing interface. It's like in our, it would kind of translate to an external API. Whereas if you look at the cloud, right, or the postal service itself, then there are operations within the postal, and I've just picked two very basic operations. One is like would be sort of a mail sorter, where you sort your mails depending on which city it goes to, which neighborhood it goes to, and then you would have a dispatching service. And there would be an interface where the dispatching service, where the the sorted mails would then be dispatched to the appropriate dispatching service. So that internal connection between the sorter and the dispatcher would kind of be an internal API, versus the connection between the postal service itself and the end user would be an external API. So this kind of talks about internal versus external APIs. Now let's move to the next aspect. So as a product manager, okay, now so far we looked at what are some of the top attributes that every application interface should have, right? We saw about the difference between internal and external APIs. The other important aspect is, now you have an API that you have developed, you understand what it's doing, you have put it out, right? You got to measure whether that API is doing what it's supposed to do, right? There has to be some level of metrics and KPIs that you guys have to, as product managers, have to evaluate, right? So I broadly classify these metrics into two buckets. One is an operational bucket that we're looking at here, and the next one would be a business bucket, right? So the operational metrics typically would indicate what is the operational performance of an API, right? It looks at attributes like the performance, right? Things like uptime, right? Things like resource utilization, right? So operationally, how efficient are those APIs? And then it sort of ties into the OpEx cost of developing that API, right? The second bucket that we can look at is the business metrics, right? And this is clearly, it tells you how an API essentially impacts your bottom line, right? Like things around monetization, right? So typically, like if you look at some popular services like Twitter, right? They have webhooks, which are again sort of a loopback interface into their system, and they charge for the usage of those webhooks. Facebook has similar webhooks which they charge for, right? So what is the monetization that an API has given you, right? The other big aspect that an API provides is it allows you to expand your ecosystem, right, of partners and users and adopters, right? So what is the adoption impact because of an API that you have delivered, right? And thirdly, and this sort of ties into the basics of any sort of business model, is what is the return on investment for your users, not even for your organization. So using this API, were your users or were your third party integrations, were they able to improve their business, right? Were they able to add some value to their business, right? So a return of investment, not just for your organization but for your kind of for the adopters as well, is a critical business metrics that, in my opinion, a product manager should look at. All right. So now this is sort of like we kind of, I tried to keep the presentation so far as non-technical as possible, away from any kind of code or any kind of tech stack or any of that stuff, right? But I just couldn't keep it all the way. So the next two slides will look at two really popular forms of an API, right? The first form is a universal resource identifier, a URI, which I would imagine most of you who have worked on, specifically an outbound nature of an API would be acquainted with. So this is what you see on the screen, is a very basic sort of a get call to an Amazon S3 bucket or Amazon S3 service. All it does is it tells you that get me a picture of puppy, right? Located at a particular S3 host, right? Again, this is a very technical slide compared to the rest of the slides. But the takeaway from this slide is that URI is a very popular form of API, especially when it comes to working with web services. And we will kind of touch base on one particular technology, which is very, very kind of dominant these days. But that's the first form of an API. The second form of an API is what we call as a software development kit, right? So these are essentially language specific, like programming language specific interfaces that are exposed to the users. And an SDK can, over here again, I've taken the same example of an S3 bucket, but an SDK can very well be an internal SDK, right? So it can also, and same thing goes with even the REST calls, right? So the REST calls, both of these forms can be external as well as internal, right? On the slides, I've taken an example of an external facing SDK, but we can very well have the exact same form used for an internal facing SDK as well. Right. So clearly over here, you see that, again, looking at our standard syntax of an API, right? It has an identifier. So like your dot object is sort of the identifier. It has a parameter list, right? It takes like 2 parameters in it. And then it also returns you something. It returns you a sort of an object, which kind of encapsulates, I would say test.py, right, inside it. So these are the two sort of very widely used forms of an API that I would imagine a product manager to know about. Right? All right. I was contemplating on putting this slide, but I think it is so common and so important, and I kind of call this slide as the talk of the town, right? Everybody these days talks about REST APIs, right? So you go anywhere, like people would talk about, okay, we have a REST API for our system. We support REST APIs, right? So REST APIs are nothing but so REST is sort of a framework or a protocol that was developed, and it gained popularity within the developer community and organizations. It's one of the most popular web APIs on the internet. In fact, I think I saw some stats somewhere where I believe around 65 or 70% of the web services are based on REST these days, right? It is lightweight, right? It does not have a very big processing overhead. It's a very easy to understand contract. So the URF form which we saw was an example of a REST call. It is stateless, right? Which is really important. What it means is that, just again going a little bit technical, a typical sort of a software system would involve some sort of a client, right, which would invoke the server, right? And what REST allows you is it does not require the client to maintain any kind of state information for an interface that it has invoked on the server. This sort of simplifies a lot of complexities, right? When it comes to things like maintaining consistent views, worrying about sort of failures, etc., etc. And it is based on top of HTTP, which is the age-old HTTP protocol for invoking web apps, right? Like it's a browser protocol. So it is based on HTTP. It also supports some popular formats, and JSON being like the most widely used data exchange format because it is sort of lightweight and open. So it does support like JSON-based payloads. So that's and there are like lots of other things which make REST really good, but these were some of the top sort of few things which I wanted to call out. And I wanted to bring this slide so that product managers who have already worked with APIs would probably know about REST, but some of you who have not ever heard of an API, REST is something which I would encourage you to kind of learn more about, just because it is a very widely used sort of a communication exchange in web services these days. All right, so before we end, right, one very critical comment, and I think Swati already had asked this question. I kind of hold back on answering it because I knew there was this one last slide, which I was going to talk about. But documentation, it is really important, right? I have to stress that. No, even if you develop like one of the best APIs, unless and until you don't document it, you would lose out on a lot of the KPIs or metrics that we discussed, right? So documentation, even though it may sound for some people, for me it doesn't, but for some people it doesn't. It sounds like not cool. I think it is a very, very critical aspect of, at least from product manager's perspective, when dealing with APIs. Okay. And documentation, like I just have like two very high impact bullet points. Is it's best to keep them updated regularly. APIs change, specifically developers or users of your APIs or your sort of customers would have a hard time, developing if they don't really have a good documentation of how to use that API, right? And the second thing is that I think I'm already shooting over time. The second thing is that they should follow standards, right? So I would highly encourage not to come up with your own style of documentation, but rather use some industry format, right? And Open API is one of those initiatives which outlines sort of how an API, specifically a REST API, should be documented. So I encourage you guys as product managers to take a look at Open API, which is sort of an industry standard these days. So I would say documentation, it is extremely critical. You just cannot ignore it, right? With that, I think this is my last slide, and I kind of thank you for listening to me. I hope I answered your questions in the comments with as much sincerity as I could. I would hand it over to Mariana.
What a great presentation, but we are not over yet because there are some questions from the audience. So first we will go about more for clarification questions, and then we'll dive right into more advanced questions. Let's go this way. So first we have a question from Shir. Or wait a second, maybe we answered that already? Security and faithfulness. Did we talk about the difference between the two?
I believe so. Like, do you want me to go over it again?
No. That's fine. It's just me not keeping an eye good enough on the chat. And we have a question from Swati, who asks, "Can you give an example for concurrency?"
Yeah, I mean, concurrency is essentially invoking the same API again and again, right? Like at the same time, right? I mean, not again and again, but at the same time, right? So for example, let's say you want to, like, let's say you are a sort of a picture hosting service, right? And like there is a very popular image of, let's say, Mount Fuji, which is there on your service, right? And a lot of people want to kind of use that picture for their own purposes, right? So it's possible that like me and Moriya can invoke the API at the exact same time, right? The API should serve both of us the exact same way, right? So it should be able to handle concurrent calls at the same time, right? This is not a very good example of concurrency. I would give you another example as well, right? So let's say that you have a bank service, right? And that service essentially you have an API where you update your bank account, right? Like bank account balance, right? And let's say that like, you know, me and Moriya, we share one bank account for some reason. I don't know why, but we do, right? And I do a withdrawal and she does a withdrawal, right? The API should be able to detect like, you know, things like you have overdrawn your account and stuff like that, and not allow like duplicate withdrawals, right? So it should allow for the consistency in those concurrent calls, right? This is a slightly better example than the non-Fuji. But the idea is that it should support concurrency.
That's a perfect example. Thank you very much. And now we're moving to the a long question from Avi that got us scared before, but we already touched upon it a little bit. And he's asking, we need to examine a channel for transferring data between an end unit, this is an IoT product, and a client's platform, web application. Between the two options available, MQTT and API, what are the relevant metrics for comparison? How do I test the suitability of an API for a solution? So we talked a little bit about metrics, but maybe we can talk more.
So we need to examine a channel for transferring data between an end unit and a client's platform.
Correct.
Between the options available, MQTT and API, what are the relevant? Well, API is not really a metric. Like, you know, I think MQTT, what you mean by that is probably the mean time to respond, right? Like the latency. That's what. So API is like a concept. You can have a metric like, you know, latency between the calls. If who asked this question by the way?
It's Avi.
Avi. So can you just expand on MQTT? There are several acronyms, but I just want to make sure I get what you're saying correct, right? But I would say that like API is not really a metric. API is sort of a concept. A metric is built on top of an API. So in your case, a metric would be what is the latency, call latency, right? Between your IoT device or your endpoint and the client's web application. That would be a very simple heuristic that one can measure. Right? The other heuristic is what is the reliability, right? So let's say the IoT makes 100 calls. Like are you, is it like reliable enough that all these 100 calls are served, right? And actually even more than that, maybe availability would be another one as well. Right? So it all depends on the nature of the call. It depends on what that call is doing, but reliability, uptime, latency, these would be the metrics that would come to my mind in kind of evaluating this transaction. Right.
So you're saying that it is a protocol.
Okay, so yeah, no clue.
Perfect. Okay, may I challenge you with a challenging question, Swanand?
Oh, you want to challenge me? Okay,
yes.
Cool. Go on.
We're product managers. We like challenges. We're here for the challenge.
By the way, Avi, I'll kind of research on it a little bit more, right? And I'll get back to you.
That's awesome of you. Thank you very much, Swanand, for this reply. Yeah. Of all the mistakes,
just send me that question. What he has sent. Just send me that question.
I'll make sure to connect you both, and we'll make sure that it will happen. Yeah. And he's saying, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Of all the mistakes that you usually see product managers often do with APIs, what are the most common mistakes?
What are the most common mistakes that a product manager does when looking at APIs?
Correct.
Well, as I said, right, like, I mean, a typical thing that I've seen product managers do is probably they don't do a holistic evaluation of the API. They look at, most likely, and it is more tied to just us being humans, is does it solve the problem, right? They are more focused on the contract that the API delivers, but they sometimes miss out on these other attributes which are really important for an API. For example, security is often overlooked, right? And it is a fact, but and the reason behind it is that it depends on what stage of maturity your product is in, right? So if you're coming from a startup, all you are is go, we need to kind of get this out, right? And you miss out on all those things, but then when something bad happens, you kind of all of the whole team starts working on resolving that security problem, right? While on the other hand, if you are a much more mature product, probably belonging to a big corporation, right, is that you would kind of tend to have a lot of guardrails against security. You would have a well-defined security sort of a requirement or a checklist that every API has to go through. Right? So that's just one example, right? There are other aspects of it as well. Like, for example, concurrency, right? A lot of people assume that it will just be one-to-one invocation. That may not be true, right? And it can get everybody in trouble, essentially, right? So I think to answer your question, product managers, at least, and that's the hard way that I've learned as well. It's not that I'm away from it, right? Is that we tend to focus more on the actual contract and we sort of overlook these other important aspects that is expected of a very solid API. So that's what I would kind of.
Wise words to all product managers in the audience. Keep away from these mistakes.
Laura has something.
Yes, so it has two parts, the question. I will read it out loud. If a product has an inbound API which was not developed for external use, would you recommend custom integration? I'm currently handling custom integration with the API of a tool which is made to be displayed in an iframe. So I'm doubting myself if I'm doing the right choice with this custom integration. Motivation is that after custom integration, it's going to look much better and it's going to be much more user-friendly, but I'm not sure it's going to work as smoothly as if we were loading it externally in an iframe. So she's debating between, the case is if a product has an inbound API that was not developed for external use, would you recommend custom integration?
Okay, so let me understand your question a little bit, right? So what you're trying to say is you have an internal API that is only used for internal consumption, but you want to selectively expose it for external integration. Is that what you're saying, or you just want to open it for this one custom integration, which some external system should be able to invoke this API? I think that's
I
what
think
you're
it's
asking.
the first. I think it's the first option. This is what I understood as well. But Chloe, can you please comment and let us know which of the options is the one you refer to? And she's saying if a product was not developed for custom API integration, but
Okay.
to be shown
All
in
right.
an iframe,
Okay.
would you
So
recommend
again,
custom
right? Yeah,
integration?
sure. I think I get what you're saying. Okay. So my response to you would be, it depends. Like, is this iframe sitting in a client app that you own, right? Which would then actually just make it like an internal kind of an invocation, right? Versus if this iframe is sitting in an app which is probably developed by some third party, let's say your partners or whoever it is, right? Then you're essentially making this API public. So like you can always have sort of secure permissions developed around an API, which would allow for custom integration. And I hope I'm answering your question over here. I think that's what you meant. And if not, then we need to just talk it out, because I'm kind of a little bit losing track of what your exact precise question is.
So please, Laura, let us know in the
Yeah.
comments
Is
if
that
it's
is that what you're talking of, or it's different? No, it's external tool, third-party provider. I didn't. Okay, so third-party provider would mean that you are actually exposing an API, right, to this particular tool. Again, then it depends on is this going to be a publicly available API, or are you just exposing this API to be used by this particular third-party sort of integration tool, right? Where any request that comes to this API just from this particular tool or this service would be entertained, whereas any request that comes to this API from anybody else would be rejected. So again, you would need to put in guardrails. I don't see it as a problem, to be honest with you, as long as the API itself is secured enough to be not exposed to anyone else, right? And again, since you are taking this big step of exporting or exposing something that is internal to external, I would assume that you have done the ROI calculation, or you have done enough valuation for this exercise that really exposing it to this third party tool would significantly boost your business metrics, right? So it's
and this
again,
is why we're meeting here.
that. So it all ties down to that ultimately, right? So
This is exactly
does
why
that
we're
answer
meeting here.
your
Yes.
question to some extent?
No. I'm sure it did. And this is actually, this is the essence of this session, right? How to enable product managers to use APIs to have better options and opportunities with the product, but how to do it in a way that won't harm them in the long run. And she's saying, yes, thank you. It just takes additional effort to make it secure, but this is the long run thing that will be
Right.
beneficial for you. Swanand, I want to challenge you with one more question before we end this session.
Yeah.
And I will give you some time to think about that. If to choose from all the things that we discussed today, these important things, if to choose one thing, if we'll have to prioritize the list of things we learned today, the one thing that you would like every product manager in the audience to remember tomorrow, what is one thing will be? And I'll give you some time to think, because I want to ask the audience please make sure to like this video and to like the page or the channel wherever you're watching us. Show us some love back. We want to give you some great content as you just consumed. Swanand, what is the one thing that you would like?
What is the one thing that you all should take away from this session?
The most important one. We're about prioritizing here.
Yeah, I think the most important one that I would say, and again, this is not a very targeted answer, but a little bit more of a generalized answer is I want you to develop a perspective of API as a concept rather than a buzzword, right? I hope that you when let's say when you go back tomorrow and there is there is a requirement that hey, like your customer is asking for an API, right? I hope you guys focus on the structure, the structural sort of strength of your API. Rather than treating it as just a sort of a buzzy thing that would just add color to your application, right? So I would say that like having a more rounded and holistic view, and I hope I've delivered it today, right? By means of this very simple example, where you don't look at APIs just like you were doing today. It changes your perspective. You start thinking about things like concurrency, things like symmetry, things like correctness, right? Things like documentation. A lot of us just ignore it, right? So that's like I want you to think of an API as a holistic entity rather than something that is talk of the town, as I call it as, right?
I love that. I love it. Very
final answer, but that's what it is. I really cannot pinpoint one slide out of the presentation. I want you to take the whole thing.
The right way to think about things is the first step that we have to take before we're doing the right job. So I think that was actually a great answer. Thank you so much, Swanand Rao, Principal Product Manager at Oracle and Product League Mentor. I learned a lot myself. I enjoyed this session so much, and I hope you had a great time with us.
Yeah, hopefully it was informative for you guys, and it was good to be here and look at some of the nice interactions that we had.
Super nice interactions, and I can share with you that we already see many thanks in the comments, and the audience love it, and they already ask for more sessions about the subject. So amazing job. Thank you very much. Have a fantastic day, and I can't wait to have you again on this stage exactly one day in the future. Thank you very much, Swanand.
All right, thank you. Thanks, guys.
Bye.